Hey, good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Hey, good. Nice to actually finally see you face to face. So we've done a lot on Facebook together. So in fact, a lot of times with people I know, I like you come in and finish them off for me. So
You set them up, I knock them down.
yeah, yeah. So we live right across the water. Where you're the only other person on this thing I think that's close to me in the area. So it's kind of cool to see that you joined.
Yep. Well, I'm not big into the debating issue. It's more of a case of I will stand and support conservative libertarian principles.
Yeah, and that's why I like the platform. You can
Yep.
to me it's a lot better than Facebook where you just kind of throw type stuff up and people start cussing at you or whatever.
Yeah, but with Facebook and writing, I mean, it's like, for example, if you ever played chess by, like old days where you could have email and you play chess over a period of time. Okay. With Facebook, if you've got thoughtful people, you can have thoughtful posts. And, unfortunately, the emotional people don't respond to thoughtful posts except by cussing and swearing, because when they start losing the debate, they have nothing to say. They resort to that and then they go away unhappy.
That seems to be most people on Facebook. So most people online. So all right, well, see how much ash I can catch today, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I think, yeah. So today it is my proposition that the Civil War was not justified, and it's the source of many of today's problems. And I think I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me on the problems that exist today, and that is mainly the size. The problems I'm going to kind of focus on are the size and scope of the federal government and the lack of power of states' rights, the actual absence of states' rights, and additionally the race issue between blacks and whites that seems to exist mostly in the U.S., but it doesn't exist in some other Western countries, specifically Britain. So when I think it was the guy that starred in Amistad. It was a movie like 10 years ago. He came. What I read is he came to the U.S. and he didn't understand He's British and he came to the U.S. and he didn't understand the race relations in the United States. That because he seemed to say it's not like that in Britain. So apparently it's just you don't have the conflict that you have in the United States. And the reason that I think the reason for that is the Civil War. So they had slaves up until 1823, I think, something like that.
33.
33. So only 20-year difference, right? And so it's not time. It's not like, oh, they had an extra 20 years and they were able to get over it. Whereas the US just needs, 20 more years. And of course, I think in 20 years, it's going to be given the way that it's been going in the last 10 years since Obama got elected, I think it's gone worse. So if we continue with this trajectory, I think it might actually be worse in 20 years. So in England, what they did to end slavery is the government, because the abolitionists really pushed, and there were a lot of them that were actually against this policy, and understandably, but they apportioned 40% of their tax revenue. It was either GDP or tax revenue, and they purchased the slaves, and then they let them go. They freed them. And so what you had instead of you had a slave owner. Now, again, you and me, we're against slavery. Got to put that out there. Going out on a limb. I'm
Okay.
against slavery.
One quick item. Are you aware of the fact that the provision for purchasing the slave owners, basically, the slaves had to work for like 60 hours a week for the next 4 years in continued labor for their former masters. So they were still enslaved for another 4 years, with a buyout being done by the slave labor over the next 4 years. So
Which
1833, they passed the Slavery Abolition Act, but the slaves weren't immediately freed. It took place over 4 years. So that's a factor you got to throw in there.
okay. Oh, is your clock going?
This is one of these where it's not. Remember, I asked you about the difference between where you start one. This one is running. We're both talking, and there's no clock on either of us. I did a debate a couple of days ago where there was no clock, so we just have to be honorable enough to kind of pass it back and forth.
Yeah, usually it says 45 minutes on top, but it still says 45 minutes.
I see.
Right.
Did you have a start on yours?
No, it never started. So I don't.
And it's
weird.
blinking as if it's it says yours says live and recording.
Yeah, I got that. We got one person watching. Is that Jordan? I'm not sure, but usually that 45 minutes starts.
Yeah, you're right. My 45 was scrolled up a high, so I didn't see. I was missing that. I scrolled it down. Now I can see the 45, and it's not ticking away. Check and see if you're seeing a button on any of yours.
No, usually that thing starts down. So
see if there's a way of stopping and restarting then.
No, if you stop, you have to start all over.
Got it.
So
in terms of starting all over, but I mean, that may not be a bad thing to do, to stop and start all over, but
set up a whole new debate.
But the question is whether or not this is going to record properly if the clock timer is not working.
Yeah, I just got a message from Georgia, so I'll see if she responds. So it is. Yeah, I actually am not too familiar with the way they did it, but the point I was saying is that in the United States, obviously, now the Civil War, I contend, and I've debated, the Civil War was not about slavery, and my opponent kept going on and on and on about secession was about slavery, and I said, okay, the secession and the Civil War are two different things. They're related, obviously, but they're not the same thing. So, anyways, that was that the Civil War itself was not about slavery, but the result of the Civil War was the slaves were freed, sort of.
Well, but you see, without revisiting the issue, the thing you have to take a look at is, I mean, you're looking at modern day and jumping to as a pro forma. Let's assume that the Civil War caused all these bad things that we're having today, and the Civil War was bad. But the thing you have to take a look at here is the fact that the run up to the Civil War was something that got nastier and nastier and nastier, and the Civil War became more and more inevitable. Okay, the population in 1860 for this country was about 31.5 billion people, and one eighth, almost 4 million, were listed by the census as slaves. One eighth of the nation.
South had, I think, 9 million people, 4 million slaves. Yeah.
What you had is various efforts. I mean, during the time of the Constitutional Convention, there were people who wanted to avoid slavery, but the nation would never have come into existence. They wrote into the Constitution that they would end the slave trade. And so after around 1807, no more Atlantic slave trade, except that was done illegally. And the only way to have slaves was breed them. Okay.
Right. I think it was 1811, and the Southern Constitution had the same. Basically, they just copied that and they changed the date.
Yep. So there was an 1820 Missouri Compromise to try and limit the growth of slavery. Certain states north of the 36-degree 30-minute parallel would be free, and below could be slave. There was a compromise of 1860, another one. But that led into whether Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state, and you had bloody Kansas. You had 4 or 5 years of fighting and confrontations, violent confrontations, trying to make the state stack the deck so that it would be either free or enslaved. And interesting, in bloody Kansas, John Brown and his followers went there to help support the abolition forces in Kansas. And while he was there, he had one of his sons was killed during some of the bloody events that happened. Okay, John Brown then subsequently in 1859, it's like he felt that slavery was just absolutely horribly evil, and it was. And that was the raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry with the idea of fomenting a slave revolt, turn the weapons over to the slaves.
Yeah.
Okay, you had just all sorts of resistance. Consider that in May of 1856, you had a representative from South Carolina, Preston Brooks. He attacked a senator, Charles Sumner, an abolitionist with a walking cane, went on the floor of Congress and beat the guy nearly to death because a couple of days before, 2 days before, the senator had given a speech where he harshly criticized slaveholders, including a relative of the congressman. So the reaction was, they were getting more and more violent, more and more willing to do everything possible to maintain slavery. There were discussions about trying to buy slaves out, and that would have been a cheap solution. But the Southerners resisted the buyout proposition. They were opposed to it. Okay, then you go to a year later, after the beating of a senator, you had the Dred Scott decision, which in the annals of court history is the most nasty, stupid, hateful decision that ever took place, where 7-2, the essence of it was Dred Scott was property, and no more than a suitcase could file suit against the owner. Property could not file against the owner, and Dred Scott had no right to file against his master to claim that he should be free. And basically, the Dred Scott decision also basically was making the standpoint that the United States has no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories. This is
right, and that was kind of my point. Is the North didn't really care. The Northern government didn't care about slaves, and so, but that's a little off topic. But you did get to a good point about the buyout.
But the point is, how do you proceed on a buyout if the people who are going to be bought out refuse to be bought out? It's more important for them to remain slaves than to be bought out. Okay, that's the essence of it. And the Supreme Court, that 7-2 ruling was principally, you had 7 Southerners and 7 Southern sympathizers who were going to basically rewrite the Constitution as necessary, just as bad or worse than Obergefell.
Yeah, so the English buyout, again, I'm not overly familiar with it, but they did is they bought the slaves. Like I guess you said, they continued to work for 6 more years, but they were free.
60 hours.
Okay.
No, yeah,
sounds like well, that's not my work week, but it sounds you work for the government.
You're free,
well, you're
but
not free
all
either.
Your salary you're going to be free for the next 4 years, but all your paychecks come to me. I like it.
Okay, yeah, I would say how much of your paycheck goes to the government today, right? Since they were the slaves were freed, right? Now the government owns you. So, but it's another topic. The point there is that when in England, when they were freed, the people. So from the perspective. So, we're pretty good economists here, right? So I think rationally, how do people see this situation? And you and me disagree with this, obviously. We're both against slavery. You can't own another man. So we're freedom fighters or believers in freedom and liberty. But if you're a slave owner and someone comes and takes your property and burns your house down in the process, you're not going to be a very happy individual, right? And then they say, okay, now you have to live next to that person and possibly employ them or something. You're just not going to enjoy that. And so you see a lot of disunity and anger between the blacks and the whites in the South in 1866, right? 1867, etc. And so they were freed, but they weren't really free completely. And you had a lot of hate between these two groups, because again, what happened is you took what the owner believed was his property, and you took it away from him. And again, you burned his house down and destroyed his entire fortune in the process. Most of the people in the South didn't have slaves. Most slaves were owned on large plantations, and they were relatively rare, small numbers. Most people were just dirt poor. We get into slavery was a poor economic method. Now you can see the North industrialized. The North had about 23 million people, and the South had 9 million people, and 4 million of them were slaves. And the North was industrialized. The Industrial Revolution brought wealth to the North, and that's why they won, is they had more people and they had more money.
Yeah.
The South
and
couldn't.
An excellent book that discovers how slavery was not efficient, it was not profitable. It gave short-term appearance of profit to the plantation owners, but they usually went into debt. In order to do it, they'd have to get more land, more debt, more slaves, and it was a vicious circle. The book is called Emancipating Slaves and Enslaving Free Men, because the Civil War set the stage up for some of the things. However, the thing you take a look at is, I take a look at the fact that man with his sin nature, you're going to have people who are going to hate. Okay, you have hating not just because the hating was going to happen. A lot of the people in the South who did not own slavery still believed the idea that the black man was inferior, and on the social ladder, the poor guy felt better because there was somebody below him on the ladder, and they were willing.
That was the North too. I mean, that was.
I understand that. But so the point is that the stage for slavery has always been there. The stage for wickedness is always there, because the heart of man, and unless they come to recognize how God's law and natural law says it's wrong for one person to own another person, it's wrong to mistreat other people, you start falling into these routines. And if the Civil War had not happened, if there had been a buyout, you'd have still had the same problems. You'd have still had the eventual growth of government. It's the tradition. I mean, if you take a look at the rise and fall of the Roman Republic, it's these things creep in, and it's the natural tendency of man to sell his birthright of freedom and liberty for bread and circuses. So whether or not Civil War had happened, we would devolve into, hey, I want a government that's going to do more for me. I'm going to give government more and more power. But ultimately, what you have to come back to is, if you talk about the avoidability of slavery, I mean, the Civil War, the thing I take a look at is that I want to do a thought experiment for you. And this is where I was asking if you'd seen the movie Jack Lemmon, How to Murder Your Wife. It's a very funny comic movie. But the idea is that in there, he's in a courtroom at the end, and he hypothesizes a situation where the guy's going to give a choice to push a button or not. He draws a button on the rail, and if you push this button, all these wonderful things will happen. Well, I'm going to put you in a courtroom, and I'm going to give you 2 buttons to push, button A and button B. Okay. However, it's December of 1860, and you and your family are slaves in the South. Okay, you're one of 4 million slaves, you, your wife, and your couple of children. With the election of Lincoln, the Southern slave supporters, who've done everything possible to block any efforts to end slavery through a normal process, the Northerners they're on fire for abolition. Okay, the government may not be, but there are all these big abolition groups. And so with the election of Lincoln, the Southerners are realizing the only way we're going to protect our chattel slavery, the institution of slavery, is if we secede. Okay, so you hear of a potential civil war. Okay, maybe you're a bit of a prophet, and you know that the Civil War will last 3 or 4 years, and it could result in hundreds of thousands of deaths. Okay, one path, you say, I'm ready for civil war. But at the end of the Civil War, 4 years from now, me, my wife, my kids, we're free. We'll have slavery will be abolished. The other button is we'll wait. No civil war. I'm going to continue in chattel slavery for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. The nation might evolve peacefully to the point where slavery is illegal in 10 or 15 or 20 years, like it happened in Britain. But in the meantime, for those next 5, 10, 15 years, my slave master is free to beat me and my wife, sell my children, do all sorts of horrible things because I'm property and I'm not a free human. You and your 4 million brethren are going to continue to endure a harsh life, the lash, mistreatments, whichever. At this point, you say, which button do you push? Do you say, let's delay the Civil War and let's give it 20 or 30 years? I mean, it's only 20 or 30 years more of bondage for me and my wife and children. Or do I've suffered long enough. My people have suffered long enough. This has got to end now. Which button do you push?
Well, the result of the Civil War.
Pick one button.
If you're saying at total destruction, if you're saying between the actual result of the Civil War and the potential result of it, maybe 15, 20 years, then because the result of the Civil War was that they weren't really free. They went back to their previous owners for the most part because they couldn't work. They didn't own property. They couldn't do anything. And so they went back to people that really hated them. I mean, because again, the owners saw these as their properties being stolen from them and the cause of their house burning down. And so
they migrated north, they migrated west. Some people stayed there. But the point is that it became their choice. They had freedom. Yes, you had some continued evil, and you had the unique case of the evil party that did everything possible when it got back into power to stifle them. The Jim Crow laws, the KKK, all the sort of stuff that happened. But they were free, and they could legally get educated. Whereas before it was illegal to educate them. They could legally pursue what they wanted to do, and a lot did. Yes, it was bad, okay? But nothing was going to change that. No civil war, avoiding a civil war would not have kept people from the evilness of desiring to have segregation and desiring to have Jim Crow laws. You could have still had the buyout and still had the nastiness.
Well, you probably would have had somewhat of a. I mean, they would not have seen them as equals. I don't believe they would have seen them as equals. It took time. It took a long time, and I think it took a lot longer than it would have if it had been a peaceful resolution, like they did in England. So I think they should have continued to try that. Now, the other part of this is that the Civil War was not justified. The South had, if we ignore the slave issue for a moment, and we say the South actually had a right to secede. I mean, states, the whole idea, and Hamilton preached this when he went around the country selling the Constitution, and he said that once states voluntarily come together, they at any time can voluntarily leave. Like you get people to a party, and we're all going to get together, and we're going to bring our food, and we're going to have a big potluck. Then at any time you decide that you don't like what's going on at the party, you can leave. And that was the basic premise of the Constitution and the formation of the United States, is that these are a bunch of separate countries that come together for the purpose of self-defense and trade and other things. But at any time, if some of them want to leave, and again, I pointed this out under John Adams, you had the Alien and Sedition Act in Virginia or South Carolina, I think it was Virginia, threatened that they were going to leave. They were going to secede over that heinous, disgusting act by founding father John Adams. He creates the Alien and Sedition Act. He threw a bunch of people in prison for calling him a name, or for merely printing something that he didn't like. And so they were going to secede until Jefferson got elected and pardoned everybody. So the right to secede of the states, that was a legal right. And the North had no constitutional power to come and attack them and prevent them from seceding. So again, we can talk about the purpose of the secession as being whether it was slavery or not. And of course, we both would be against that. I am just saying that I think it would have been a lot better off if they had continued to work on some kind of peaceful resolution, and you would have a lot better relations between blacks and whites today. Now, the funny thing is, if you look at the last couple decades, a lot of northern blacks in the north and the sage from South Central, what's his name? The radio guy? He calls himself this. What?
Doesn't sound
he calls
like
himself the sage from South Central. He's on the radio. He's on 1500 today at 3 to 5:30, I think. Blanking on his name, but anyway, he's very famous. He's a nationally syndicated. His father was born in the South. I think he was born in L.A., so I think he was born in South Central. But he talks about how his father didn't like the North. He said the North, they were very racist, but they hid it. He'd apply for a job. Oh, you're not qualified. He was a cook on a Navy ship, and so he's like a chef. But oh, you're not qualified to cook at a diner, right? In the South, they would say we don't hire N. It's like they're much more open about it. Now, today, a lot of people are moving to the South. A lot of blacks are moving to the South because the way of life. And you can talk to Rush Limbaugh's, his producer is a black man. Yeah, it's Nerdly. And he was interviewed by Todd Herman here, right? Because Todd Herman took over for him for 2 days.
I heard that.
And he said that he thought Seattle which is kind of the area that we refuse to live in, right? Neither you nor I could imagine living in Seattle, I think, correct? Yeah, and so Snerdley, he agreed. He would never live in Seattle. He said it's the most racist place that he's ever been. And so that's a lot of people are moving to the South because it is it's much better way of life. People are very friendly down there, whether you're black or white. They don't really care that much. They have the rebel battle flag, but it's not considered a symbol of hate to most of the people down there. Now you have a lot of crazies that just say, hey, there's a riot down the street. Let's go. Let's join up, right? I don't know what they're rioting about, but let's have fun.
That's your Antifa type people. I mean, every society is full of leftists who want government handouts and they want bigger government, and they're willing to do nasty stuff. You can go to the conservative cities, not that they're big, there are not many big conservative cities, but you can go to areas where they're conservatives and there'll still be the Antifa element that are haters. Okay. But here, let's get back to the basic issue. Okay. First of all, when you talk about secession, ultimately, I think it's inarguable that the southern states were seceding over the desire to maintain slavery. Their resolutions of secession that their legislators passed listed preservation of slavery as usually the number one reason for seceding, because they felt that with Lincoln as president, that slavery would become outlawed and they were going to have none of that. So in order to preserve slavery, they were seceding. That's a secessionist reason. Now, at some point, whether the North was wrong to not let them go, that's an interesting debate. Side note. Okay, I met a Medal of Honor recipient, and I used him as a guest speaker for a course that I would teach on leadership. And he was commenting something to the effect of, because somebody says, well, how did receiving the Medal of Honor change your life? And his reaction was, I didn't have a chance to live the alternate life, so I don't know. Okay.
Right, the counterfactual, you can kind of propose, and this might have happened.
And what we take a look at is that we look at 1861, and you see that all the trends up to 1861 is the South was going to get more and more violent to preserve slavery. They were going to do whatever it took to preserve slavery. They were going to secede. They were going to keep slaves. And then you and I both agree that slavery was immoral and just a horrible institution. And so at some point, Lincoln, between a desire to save the Union and his statements that if he could save the Union by keeping slaves done, he would have done it. But keeping the Union was in power. Okay. Ultimately, what you take a look at is the alternate universe wasn't possible. There was no way that you were going to resolve slavery in another 5 or 10 or 15 years peacefully. The war was made inevitable by Southerners who were willing to fight and die to keep slavery. And ultimately, what happened in the Civil War, how familiar you are with Lincoln's second inaugural address?
That was, I'm not sure what it is right now, but
okay. Lincoln's second inaugural address is a fairly short one, and it is some of the most powerful statements in that second inaugural. He refers to God and God's divine justice several different times. Near the end of it, he speaks about how both sides sought divine assistance. He spoke, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's face. But let us not judge. Let us judge not that we not be judged. So he's basically saying, how here it's like, how can the South be praying to God to give us victory so we can keep slaves? But they were doing it. Okay. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. It was not over swiftly. He continues on. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove. So God's going to allow slavery to be ended. And that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? And here's the telling paragraph. He continues, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills it, that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, i.e. destroyed, all the 250 years of slaves' work destroyed, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As it was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Okay, Lincoln's second inaugural was basically saying the Civil War was very likely God's punishment on this nation for its unwillingness to end slavery. And the pain and suffering of the Civil War is basically payback for 250 years of horrors inflicted on, at the time of 1860, 4 million slaves, but slaves through the centuries.
And again, we can point out that the slavery that existed in the South was very different than the slavery that existed in most other places. You know, most slavery in ancient times, biblical times, people were essentially free. Their labor, specifically their labor, was paid to their owner. They weren't
serfs.
Yeah, they were able to walk around town. They just couldn't vote. They couldn't participate in political matters and things. But they could walk around town. They could kind of go out and go to the bar or whatever. But that's so. I think that inaugural address was meant to bring slavery issue into it much more, so they could kind of like the WMDs, right? Well, they weren't there, so Saddam's a bad guy, and that's what it's really about. It's about taking out a dictator.
This was in April of 1865. The war is almost over. In a few more weeks.
But it kind of represented what had been pushed towards the end. Is that okay? So we're trying to get the people on our side, and they started to instigate that as a purpose much more than it was in the beginning. So whether it was not, but again, I would say. Okay, so we got about 10 minutes, I think. But I think it's
to find out that this hasn't been recorded.
She said it was going, so she
Yeah,
sent me
but
a
it's live
text about
streaming,
something else. So.
Live streaming, but the question is it recorded?
I don't know. Well, hopefully. So what I was saying is that they had the right to secede. Secession was always a threat against federal power, right? Well, after the Civil War, forget about it. You have no right to secede, and the threat of secession against federal power is gone. So it's kind of like the states used to say, okay, federal government, if you keep abusing us and taxing the heck out of us, which is what they were doing to the South and really destroying the South's wealth, then we're going to secede. And now the North can say, well, remember the Civil War didn't work out. You're never going to secede. You're never leaving, right? So kind of a woman that saying leave, I'm going to leave, and the husband finally locks her in the room and ties her, chains her to something. She's not leaving, right? The South. That's I think what happened is the Civil War expanded federal power to be unlimited almost. So the loss of the ability of the status for a state to reject the federal government's demands on their right to secede. And so again, I talked about the relationships. I don't think that the vast majority of the South said, yes, I would like to fight and die and sacrifice my entire fortune. So some guy I hear about that lives, 20 miles down the road can own a few people. I just don't see that anybody in the South actually fought for that. I think there were a lot of other reasons that they fought for. They fought for freedom and self-rule. And there was even today, you see a lot of difference in the cultures between the South and the North. It's two different countries.
Most people in the South that were fighting for the idea of states' rights. I don't dispute that. But you're still stuck with the fact that it's like, if you're going to fight, you got to make sure that you've got a good cause behind you to fight for. Okay, if the Southern states, if we're talking hypotheticals, it's like the alternate life that you never really can live.
Yeah.
If the Southern states were so upset with the whole concept, the best thing for them to have done would have been to say, all right, you don't like slavery. Well, we don't like you, Northerners. We don't like being used with the tariffs and all the other problems. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to end slavery. Now that slavery is over and ended and all these people are free, we're seceding because you do not treat us with proper respect. Now, if slavery was over, the North there would have been almost zero support in the North. When Lincoln was rounding up troops to send to stop the rebellion, there was very little motivation by Northerners to support fighting over the issue of secession. It's like, let them go.
Well,
but when it was the idea of,
there was anyway, I don't think there was much support anyways. He had to draft some 100,000 troops. So
minimal, as you get some people who will do it for the fun of fighting, et cetera, but the vast majority had to be drafted. But when you turned it to, we're going to free the slaves, and that happened around 1863, when the focus shifted to become freeing the slaves. The Battle Hymn of the Republic became very popular. It became a fight song. Okay, the refrain that as Jesus died to save men, let us die to set men free. Okay, there was a big sympathy for freeing slaves. If you want an alternate universe, imagine the alternate universe where the South, before they secede, they free the slaves, and then they go back to Congress and say, all these bad laws that burden us and benefit the North are reasons why we're seceding.
Well, again, I would compare it to the Revolution, where they kept slavery in there with the purpose of eventually ending it, hence the 1811. And they needed a few wealthy people to be on their side. Now, had they ended it, you would have had a group of powerful individuals who would not have been for the secession. So I think to I wouldn't contend that at all. That you needed a few wealthy, powerful individuals on your side, but the vast majority was not.
We're still going back to the issue.
So
the reality was the South was seceding to maintain slavery. Slavery was immoral, and you probably had probably 80 to 90% of the slaves in the South were quite willing to see a civil war in order that they might have freedom. Even freedom under Jim Crow and segregation, they had freedom. And of course, if you want to have a fun one, you mentioned this one black radio host. You probably listened to Walter E. Williams a few times. And you remember some of his shticks when he fills in for Rush.
Black by popular demand.
By popular demand. And what did he call the NAACP?
I forget.
The Klan with a tan.
Yeah. So.
Okay. And ultimately, he's so thankful that he grew up in a period where, although you had segregation and Jim Crow, you didn't have the liberals and the NAACP doing all their nanny state stuff, because what happened in the 1960s with the growth of government under LBJ, welfare programs. Oh, hey, we'll give women big money if they're single. You incentivize women to get pregnant and be single, and you grow the government.
Right, and they're much worse off than they were back then. I mean, you could look at the unemployment rates are much higher with blacks than they were then, and it's a mess. It's really awful. That out of wedlock births are 3 times what they were back then. So all kinds of issues. The relative wealth comparisons is they're much worse off than they were back then, etc. Yeah. So big government is the problem. But, again, I think the outcome of the Civil War is one of the results of the Civil War specifically, that big government has all this power. And I mean, Lincoln just eliminated states' rights altogether and centralized federal power with the federal government. And then you had an explosion of power with the federal government. And so a lot of that we see today.
Yeah, but you can say the same. Any president is going to grab on to power that he deems necessary. I mean, you mentioned John Adams, second president who, the Alien and Sedition Acts, he gets the Congress to do, his bidding, and he passes something that's blatantly unconstitutional. You go to Andrew Jackson. Okay, Andrew Jackson, he wants to move Indians off and violate all sorts of treaties. The Supreme Court rules against him, and his reaction was, let them enforce their decree. He's going to do what he wants in spite of it. The point is that you get bad people in power, they're going to grab power and they're going to do evil things, whether there was a previous example or not. Lincoln wasn't the first to do some bad things, and he wouldn't, and others would have done bad things if he hadn't been there as an example.
But I think he provided them with the power necessary. And so you're going to get in the given the nature of the presidency, I think mostly bad people are going to gravitate towards it. Now, I actually like the one who's there now for the most part. I think he's one of the few who's not power hungry. He had power before he got there. But given the nature of the presidency, bad people are going to gravitate towards power over other people. And Lincoln created a scenario where the president has that absolute power. So before that, I think you had a lot of states that could have said, hey, we're not putting up with that garbage. We're out of here. But states won't do that anymore. So I think we got probably a minute left. I'm just looking at the actual time rather than the
have a clock. The question is, if it didn't record, then what do you do? How do you recreate
infinite time? So that was my basic contention, is that the states had a right to secede. We don't have to talk about why they seceded, but just that they had the right to secede, and the fact the Civil War happened, states no longer have any power to reject federal government's power. And that we see the result of the Civil War is you have this long-standing 152-year continuation of kind of a divide between the races. Now, I think a lot of the divide is coming from government and other NCAA or NAACP and groups like this that are really creating this divide and conquer mentality, make people unhappy, make them hate this other group. And then, of course, they make a lot of money doing that. And the race baiters and all these people. So
I think the idea of secession is one of those unsettled questions. It's a debate back and forth as to whether there was provisions for secession, how it would have been done. There was no way to allocate how a state, there was no, within the Constitution, they never really envisioned a way of separating. Okay, it might be something like where you get married and you take, you have a marriage contract that says till death do us part, but when one's out and the other one hasn't died, you now have to come up with some sort of fabricated agreement for separation and divorce. They did not envision it. They did not provide for it. Who gets custody of federal assets on state territory? If the federal government is running a debt, what percentage of the debt is now borne? I mean, California, the liberals there would like to secede from the union. And my reaction would be, hey, let California have a vote, and all those counties that want to secede can secede from the union, and all the counties in California that want to secede from Granolasville can secede from California and remain with the union. But then you take a look at it, and it's like, well, maybe 20% of the union, the population is in California. And so ultimately maybe 30 million, one-tenth of the population of California, from San Francisco to down to LA, they along the coast, they carve out and they be the People's Republic of California, a free and separate state. But all of the military institutions get moved out of there, and they're stuck with 1/10 of our national debt, $2 trillion, and they take care of all. There's no provisions for defining who gets what. I mean, look at the discussions on in Great Britain on Brexit. How do you withdraw from the European Union, and who pays what and what costs and how much do you pay? There was no provisions in the Constitution for a normal secession. It would have had to have been thrashed out. The stupid thing that the South did is they fired on Fort Sumter. If they wanted to secede, they should have done nothing that was provocable, and they should have been able to go and debate and done other things. It was that stupidity of seceding and then firing and creating a rebel. And ultimately, it's like the power is the power that you grab and take. There was no constitutional case against Lincoln saying that he could not enforce keeping the Union together and that the states had the right to secede. Okay, he suspended habeas corpus, and in 1863, Congress passed a law that gave the president the power to suspend habeas corpus through the insurrection. So sometimes, good or bad, sometimes power is what you take. And when you have an argument, you better make sure you've got a good argument that that's defensible. And for the Southerners to secede in support of slavery, big mistake.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have infinite time, I think. We've been going for 50 minutes in a 45-minute session.
And we're probably going to have this not recorded.
Which is unfortunate, because I know she said she's going to send it to tech, so we'll see what happens. But I'm going to plug it in right now. So anyways, do you want to give a final statement?
Well, I just
end there.
Slavery is a great stain on our nation, and I think Lincoln's second inaugural, basically all the horrendous things that happened during the Civil War were very likely, God's punishment on the United States for failing to end it sooner and peacefully. What's happened since then, it's man's normal sin nature. You can go and take a look in the Bible in the Old Testament times before you had King Saul, where people would be afflicted and they would cry out to God, and God would deliver them from bondage, and they would be in wonderful condition. But the natural gravity would be, after 3 or 4 generations, they would turn away from God. They would worship Baal. They would worship other gods. Their sin nature would lead them to the point where God would turn their back and allow them to suffer occupation, harassment by invading powers, et cetera, et cetera. And only when they were truly afflicted would they turn back to God. I think man's sin nature, presidents and Congresses are going to do what people want, and people don't. The number of people like you and me who are conservative, libertarians, limited government. I don't want big federal government pork barrel programs for me, because when you have programs for me, you're going to have programs for everybody else too, and we're going to be bankrupt. Maybe $20 trillion in debt. That's going to happen whether Lincoln existed or not. That's just a natural progression.
Okay. Well, it's been nice chatting with you. Well, maybe we could find another thing we disagree on. we agree on the vast majority of things, I think.
The essence is, and it's just a question of whether we would have an alternate universe that might have had a better outcome. And my reaction is, how do you prove an alternate universe would have a better outcome when ultimately what happened was a righteous solution to an evil?
Well, I think that was the only thing, is that I don't think that the Civil War was a righteous solution. So
it was the only available righteous solution at the time.
Well, I don't agree with that, but I say there was a better possible outcome. Now, again, you can't prove the counterfactual and say this is what. But again, this is kind of the ANCAP, right? The anarcho-capitalists. If we did this, this would happen. Yada yada. I'm like, well, I don't really buy that, and you don't really know what would happen, because it doesn't happen, and it really can't happen. And obviously, you can't go back 160 years and change history and see what would have happened. So what would have happened, who knows? But I just would say that the result of the Civil War, there was a lot of really terrible things that came out of it.
And we agree on that.
Yeah.
But
so
the thing is that ultimately, I think that the Civil War was made inevitable by the South.
Okay. So,
and if you'd been a slave at that time, you'd have been welcoming it.
That might be true. Yeah. I probably would have enjoyed being free. Yes. So and again, I think man should be free,
Yeah.
And what defines a slave? Right? Somebody takes more than half of your income, your property. So his issue for a whole nother debate.
Oh, sure.
Probably wouldn't debate.
Somebody like in New York who gets maybe 60% of their income is taxed by the state, federal, and city.
Been there, done that. Yeah. So the city taxes, the state taxes your income, and you pay a 10, 11% sales tax. So, all right, Mike.
All right.
Good luck with your future debates. Thanks for coming on. And I think we might have the record at 55 minutes.
Well, so I'll click